What the heck? Dude, look at this thing. He's kind of cute.
Look at him.
Let's put it back where I found him.
Alright, just hurry up because we gotta get back.
He won't stop.
What is
Dude,
going
what the?
on?
What the?
Maneater. Hazard level S+, HP is 5, it will insta-kill you, max spawn is 1, and it's most commonly found on Vow. In their baby form, Maneaters have 4 phases: roam, observe, cry, and run. In their adult form, they have 3 phases: roam, stalk, and attack. When a Maneater first spawns, it will immediately enter its roaming phase, which has 2 cycles. During cycle 1, the Maneater will use the standard AI search routine for 26 seconds. After the 26 seconds, the Maneater will then begin walking towards the closest player for 14 to 26 seconds. If the Maneater doesn't find a player when that timer is up, it will switch back to the standard AI search routine and repeat this cycle until it finds a player. Cycle 2 will only occur if the Maneater has spotted a player before. During this cycle, the Maneater will use the standard AI search routine for 8 to 20 seconds, then it will sit for 8 to 20 seconds. This will also repeat until the Maneater finds a player. Every 3 seconds it's sitting, there is a 10% chance it will roll over, which I will elaborate on later in this video. Once the Maneater spots a player, it will enter its observe phase. The Maneater will enter this phase if it spots a player, scrap, equipment, or a dead body. If it spots scrap or equipment, the Maneater will stop and stare at it for about 12 seconds. Every 1/5 of a second, there is an 8% chance the Maneater will eat the item, making it disappear forever. You'll also notice the Maneater puts on a couple pounds with every item he eats. If the Maneater spots a player, he will follow that player over any scrap or equipment. There are 2 important parameters the Maneater uses. The first is the like meter, which determines how much the Maneater likes each player. If you're the first player he meets, the Maneater will always like you, and for every other player, there's a 50% chance he'll like you and a 50% chance he won't. The Maneater will always follow the player he likes most if there are multiple players around him. There's an easy way to test if the Maneater likes you. If the Maneater likes you, you can hold him for as long as you'd like. However, if the Maneater doesn't like you, he will begin squirming and then crying within the first 30 seconds or so. Just know that if the Maneater likes you, he will always like you, and if he doesn't like you, then he will pretty much never like you. The second parameter is the loneliness meter. The loneliness meter is pretty complicated, but to keep it simple, it's pretty much just a cooldown system. When a Maneater spots a player, he will usually follow that player for about 22 seconds. The amount of time the Maneater follows you is completely dependent on how much he likes you. If he doesn't like you, he'll follow you for as low as 6 seconds, and if he really likes you, he can follow you for up to 1 or 2 minutes, and sometimes even longer. Once the follow timer is up, the Maneater no longer feels lonely and will return to phase 1. This is when his curious timer begins, which lasts about 15 seconds. During this time, the Maneater will only observe players he hasn't observed before. Once the curious timer is up, the Maneater will then begin to feel lonely and will look for any player for the next 9 seconds. If the Maneater doesn't spot a player within his lonely timer, he will begin crying. This means if you leave a Maneater alone for too long, he will begin crying. The Maneater can cry for a variety of reasons, which I'll list on screen. The first 4 are the ones you'll want to remember. If its lonely timer expires, as I just mentioned, if it's brought outside, if a Maneater rolls over, and most importantly, if it hears a noise. This includes noises like dropping items, audible items, and even flashlights turning on or off. Maneaters won't cry from your footsteps or jumps, but they will cry from pretty much every other noise. The Maneater's cry phase is essentially an irreversible countdown starting at 17 seconds, which we will call the transform timer. Whenever the Maneater is crying, the timer is counting down, and once that timer reaches 0, the Maneater will transform. If the Maneater starts crying from being held too long by a player he doesn't like, this will drop the transform timer 3 times faster, and if you hit the Maneater, this will knock 10 seconds off the transform timer. You can stop the crying by soothing the Maneater with a gentle rock for 1.5 seconds. As soon as the Maneater stops crying, you can drop him. If the Maneater throws up after soothing him, this means his countdown is very low and he's very close to transforming. You can also shake the Maneater by double clicking, however this method will take longer to calm him down. If you have a high fear level, which I covered in my fear and insanity video, then you'll be forced to use this method. Also, please note that you cannot soothe the Maneater while he's outside. Remember, this countdown is irreversible, so if the Maneater cries for 5 seconds, there's no getting that 5 seconds back. Also, if the Maneater begins crying before he spotted any players, his transform timer will deplete extremely slow. So if a Maneater is crying the first time your team runs into him, you can assume he has at least 12 or 13 seconds left on his transform timer. Hitting the Maneater will not only make the Maneater cry, but it will also send him into phase 4. The Maneater can enter his run phase for a few different reasons, which I'll list on screen. When a Maneater enters this phase, he will sprint towards the furthest node from what scared him. After 10 seconds, the Maneater will return to his roaming phase. Most of the time, the Maneater will be crying when he's running. It's very important that you catch him and soothe him, because while he's running and crying, his transform timer drops twice as fast. The only time the Maneater will run without crying is if you shake him too long, then drop him, which I guess can be useful if you need the Maneater to get away from you for some time. The best way to deal with the Maneater is to make sure he never wanders away. Basically, someone needs to babysit him. There's a secret to the follow timer that I didn't mention. As I mentioned before, the follow timer usually lasts about 22 seconds. What I didn't mention is that the follow timer will restart every time you pick up and drop the Maneater. So all you have to do is pick up and drop the Maneater before the follow timer expires, and he will always follow you. Now, I also mentioned that the more the Maneater likes you, the longer he'll follow you. The only way to get the Maneater to like you more is to soothe him. The more you soothe him, the more he'll like you, so I'd recommend soothing him anytime you have an extra slot. If you soothe him for about a minute, this will bring his follow timer up to about a minute. The reason you want to do this is because if you're deep inside and your inventory is full, you don't want to have to keep dropping items to pick the Maneater up. If he likes you a lot, you can safely make your way to the exit without having to pick the Maneater up as often. These strategies will only work for players that the Maneater likes, so I recommend that whoever runs into the Maneater first is deemed the babysitter. If the Maneater doesn't like you, there is actually a way to get him to like you. A player that he likes is going to pick up the Maneater, then drop him. As soon as the Maneater is dropped, the player who the Maneater doesn't like is going to pick him up and soothe him for about 5 seconds, then drop him. Repeat this about 4 or 5 times, and the Maneater will like you, and once he likes you, he will always like you. The biggest issue with the Maneater following you is that he'll cry every time you drop an item. The only way to avoid this is to run far enough behind a wall and drop your items so the Maneater doesn't hear it. Just be sure you don't break line of sight with the Maneater for more than 2.5 seconds, or he'll return to phase 1 and wander off. If you don't feel like dealing with the Maneater, you can always lock him behind a pressure door or put him in the main entrance room in Mineshaft Interiors. Once the Maneater enters his adult form, he becomes a completely different enemy. Before I explain that, I first want to give a huge shout out to Jabu for single-handedly decompiling every line of code in the Maneater AI. I also want to give a shout out to Nero for helping with clips and some very important game testing. This video would not exist without them, so join the Discord and show them some love. The Maneater's roam phase works a little different when he's in his adult form. The Maneater will designate a random node as his nest and will stand completely still on this node. In Facility and Manor Interiors, his nest will always be centered on a random node, but on Mineshaft Interiors, Maneaters use a completely different node called a cave node. Cave nodes are used for the same things AI nodes are used for, with the only difference being that they are only located inside caves. The Maneater's nest will grow over time as long as players are indoors. It'll take about 45 seconds for the nest to reach its maximum range of 110 units, which is about the size of a Titan interior. If there are no players indoors, then the nest will shrink back down to its minimum size of 30 units in about the same amount of time. If a player steps within the Maneater's nest, he will enter his stock phase. While you're in the Maneater's nest, he knows exactly where you are and exactly how to get to you. He will essentially try to get as close as he can to you without being spotted, very similar to Bracken's. The way this feature is coded is actually really interesting. There are quite a few checks, but the main one is that the Maneater will basically look at all the nodes around you and ask itself if it can path to one of those nodes without crossing your line of sight. If the answer is yes, the Maneater will go straight to that node and wait until it can get closer. The Maneater doesn't always necessarily follow you, he will just lurk near corners and walls around you as long as you're in his nest. While the Maneater is in its adult form, it will try to bait you towards it by fake crying. These fake cries consist of regular sounding cries and cries with a deeper tone behind it. If the Maneater manages to get within 7 units of you, he will enter his attack phase. As soon as the Maneater attacks, he will squat down and leap directly towards the closest player, killing them on collision. You can outrun this attack if you have a ton of space, but 99% of the time the Maneater will catch up even if you're turning corners. The only good counter I've seen to this attack is closing a door on the Maneater right when he leaps. If you're able to successfully dodge the first attack, the Maneater will have a 1.7 second cooldown, then he will begin chasing you. If the Maneater manages to get within 4 units of you, he will leap again. The only way to get the Maneater to stop chasing you is to run 15 units away and break line of sight, or leave his nest. Outside, the Maneater does not use a nest, he'll simply use the standard AI search routine, and if you step within 23 units of him, he will enter his attack phase, making him even more dangerous. When a Maneater is in its baby form, it is completely invincible. Hitting it will only make it run away and transform faster. While a Maneater is in its adult form, it has 5 hit points. Normally, this would mean you can one-shot it with a shotgun, but this isn't true with Maneaters. They will take 5 hits no matter the source, meaning even if you use a shotgun, it will still take 5 shots to kill. Maneaters are very hard to kill, and they aren't affected by stun grenades, making them even harder to kill. The best way, and pretty much only way to kill a Maneater, is with a knife. Bring it to a long hallway, stab it to send it into its adult phase, and as soon as the Maneater crouches down to leap, sprint backwards to dodge the attack. Once the Maneater lands, swing your knife like your life depends on it, and you should get the kill in one go. When you do this, make sure you're close enough to the Maneater for him to attack, because if you stand too far, he'll just enter his stock phase. Maneaters are most common on Vow, and if you're ever in a mineshaft interior, expect to see one because they're 1.7 times more likely to spawn in mineshaft interiors. We're almost at 70,000 subscribers. Make sure you guys like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video.